Thank you, Dr. Newton. This time we're going to shift into another gear of asking questions of the two panelists. So as I stated in the beginning, you are free to approach the mic on your own. Stack it at no more than 4. Please keep your question/comment at 3 minutes. With some time for rebuttal, some room in there for that, but also to be conscious that we get the most participation today as possible. Let's see, there is at least one legal issue. I don't know if we said this at the beginning, Daryl. I don't remember hearing it, so you might want to speak to that in just a second. But there is a legal issue as to at least one question that can't be asked. I think that's right. You want to come on up and say something about that?
Should have mentioned this earlier. Because of pending litigation around one of the wells, the well on the Fedora property, I believe Dr. Newton mentioned that, the attorney or the scientist representing the Board of Public Works tonight, Dr. Shanahan, will not be commenting on that well. Dr. Newton has agreed to comment on that. But that question will not necessarily be addressed by both of the panelists.
All right, thank you. So we're running, I think, a good time. Our agenda says here that we would have started at 8:10 for this portion, and we have 90 minutes. At 9:30 or 9:40, we will this portion of the meeting will end, and it will go into an actual board meeting. Am I right about that? Okay, thank you. So let's begin with questions from the floor. As you're comfortable coming to the podium. Also want to just say that this is an opportunity for us all to gain some understanding about those big terms that were just used that I didn't even know about. So hopefully we can do this very cordially and in a good spirit. Okay, you can either come to the podium or would you like, no? Okay. I think there's a mic that we'll need to use so that this is being recorded, sir. Okay.
You mentioned some contamination from a well. I missed exactly where the well is in relation to the landfill. Is it to the south? How far away is it? What is the relation of the well to the other landfills in the area?
The well that I gave with the well that I gave the chemistry for is located less than 1,000 feet from the landfill and is south and west of the landfill.
Hello, my name is Andrew Woodland, 907 West Hampton Road, Florence. My question is first for Dr. Shanahan. I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the factors that Dr. Newton had mentioned and whether you agree or disagree with them and why you either disagree or chose not to include them. And then perhaps Dr. Newton could respond to your response. Thank you.
Well, you know, what I know of his input or what I've seen tonight, so I'm not really in a good position to comment on it. It's obviously fairly complicated material, and I'd need to study it to understand, what sort of assumptions he made. I don't know if a report's been prepared, but at least it hasn't been made available to me. I guess, I would say in general, I don't feel like our models are particularly different. They seem to be predicting about the same sort of thing. They're showing substantial reduction in contaminant concentrations. I know you indicated it was 10 parts per billion at the Maloney well. I don't know what concentration you started with in the leachate for that.
The same as you did.
Okay,
so used exactly the same inputs, and we saw a maximum for the conservative contaminant of about 15 or 20 parts per billion, with reaching 10 at about 41 plus years.
Yeah, well, the 41 years tracks our travel times quite closely. The concentrations are a bit different. I know, I think you said that, the model is I forget your exact words, but I think the essence of your remarks is the model is only a planning tool. It's not something you can make precise forecasts with. And I would endorse that. That's really what these models are used for, is to use for planning to help make decisions. Therefore, you try and be conservative. You try and show that, even with some pretty outlandish assumptions, that in fact there would not be a substantial impact or a significant impact. And that was the approach we used, and it was one that the DEP accepted. So I feel like we went down generally the right track. Now, obviously, I've heard it said if you get two hydrologists in a room, you'll have three opinions at least. So, there's always going to be some differences in how you represent these complex systems. But my sense in looking at the work tonight, which is all I've seen, is that we're not too far apart.
If I could just have one more follow-up. Would it be, would Dr. Newton's assumptions be something that might be taken into consideration in revising a model, perhaps?
Yeah, that could be. That could be. I mean, I don't pay the bills, but that could well be if there's a. We have, in fact, for example, when we presented our first model to the town of East Hampton, they had some additional data which we did not realize. They had some additional data that they called to our attention, and so we, revised the model at that point to incorporate that data. So.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Newton. Do you think that taking 2 samples from the wetlands behind the Fedora's house is sufficient? If yes, why? If not, why not?
Well, I obviously would like to see lots of samples. I think you need to have lots of samples. You need samples through time as well. Just looking at that well that I showed with the cadmium, high cadmium concentrations, that occurred over a period of 1 year. It went from almost a very small number to a very large number. And so I think you have to sample through time, and you have to sample at a lot of places. Otherwise, you won't capture where the leachate's actually moving. Remember that the aquifer itself is very heterogeneous. You can't say it's homogeneous and that things are going to move. And when we make our models, we end up making them very homogeneous. We can't model the heterogeneity very well. I think when you go out and actually measure things in the field, you want to take lots of measurements.
Second question, should further testing be conducted at the end of Park Hill Road where it runs quite red? And the DEP said that they would be doing some additional testing.
As a scientist, I always say take more samples.
Okay.
More samples. Always it's better to have more samples.
Thank you.
Hi. Dr. Shanahan, your conclusions were based on the use of a rather sophisticated liner system. And just by way of background, I'm originally from Buffalo and sort of lived through Love Canal. So the question is, what would happen if the liners did not retain their integrity and were breached, as were the then state-of-the-art containment system in Niagara Falls?
Well, the one I guess subtlety or subtle correction is that when we looked at the leakage rates, we looked at the unlined portion of the landfill and did a calculation for that part. We did another calculation for the other phases, assuming a single liner. And if the liners fail, then obviously the results would be different. I would take issue with one of the things that Dr. Newton said, is that he seemed to imply that the landfill would act as a source of the same strength forever. Well, in fact, there are attenuation processes which occur within the landfill, and so that the source, the source strength diminishes over time. So that's one factor that would basically work in your favor. Time is on your side to an extent on that. The other thing is that there is, growing experience with these landfill liners. What is a critical part of them, is how well they're constructed. That turns out to be a very important factor. But they're increasingly getting longer and longer history with those liner systems, and they seem to be doing quite well. There was one other thing I was going to say, and I've lost my train of thought here. What was it? Well, it couldn't have been too important. So, I guess the other thing is one of the reasons we use a composite liner is that obviously you can perhaps imagine that plastic might change its properties over time, that might fail in some way or another. But then the clay beneath it is a natural material, and that actually turns out to be a very robust material. And in fact, it has a property known as self-healing. So, for example, if the clay gets, shifted, if you get settlement and the clay gets shifted and it shears and you get a break in it, it actually tends to knit itself together again back over time, particularly under the pressure of the landfill. So that's something that kind of, is a sort of a safety factor, if you like, in using both the clay as well as the plastic liner material.
Is there a degree of scientific certainty as to how reliable the liners might be?
Well, I'd have to say yes, there is a degree of scientific certainty. I mean, there's a well-established practice in this. There's a well-established literature. There's been lots of research done over the years. It's the material of choice. It's what the EPA regulations state you will use for both municipal solid waste and hazardous waste landfills. So, there is really a track record with this material, and it's how we do things. So I think there is a scientific standard behind it.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name's Kevin Cook. I'm a hydrologist from Amherst. Sorry, there's 3 in the room.
Uh-oh.
I'm familiar with mod flow, and I understand that the accuracy of the calculations increase with the number of inputs. I'm wondering what sort of data points were used in modeling this? Were things field tested? Did you use residential wells, for instance, for constructing flow models? Did you do any testing of residential well water around the landfill to determine if there had been any transport of leachate and use that in the model?
Well, we tended to use as kind of our primary source of information the studies that were done by the U.S. Geological Survey, and so those are very well regarded work. The USGS has a very high-level system of quality control, and so in essence, we kind of used their analyses of the well data to construct regional maps as far as the distribution of properties and so forth. So, for example, it would be much too much of an effort for us to go out and, drill wells and figure out where the extent of the clay is. But the USGS has gone through all those available well records and mapped that out. So that tended to be our primary source of information. There were some gaps in that, however. There are some places that weren't mapped, and that's where we went to secondary sources. So if you remember those 2 slides I had, the one with the list of publications and the second one was the list of studies. So where we didn't have good information from the published work from the USGS, that's where we went to those secondary sources and went to consultant reports, drilling logs, and that sort of thing. So, a bit of a matter of efficiency, I guess. We didn't go to that extensive detail where, the USGS had already covered the ground, but we did go further where the USGS hadn't, the information was lacking.
Okay, and was there any field proofing in your study of the USGS information to see that it's consistent with I have no idea of how old those reports are. I know that some of them go back to the early 1900s.
One of the nice things about geology is at least it doesn't change too much. So, the old reports are still very valuable, unlike a lot of things nowadays, which has a shelf life of a year or so. The old geological reports are still worthwhile, and we get as many as we can. There's one particular question, and I may need some help here because I'm trying to remember events from 5 or 8 years ago now, but there was one question. There's kind of a little window, if you like. If you remember, there's sort of 2 valleys, and there was a little bit of a gap through which that plume movement went, those travel paths went. And that was kind of an open question. In fact, I think when we first looked at this, that was thought not to be a open passageway. And I believe we had some geophysical studies done to, clarify whether there had been some information which suggested that might in fact be open. We had some geophysical studies done to determine what the bedrock surface was there. So that was a place where we had reason to suspect the USGS map. We went out and did some more work and, basically connected the aquifers at that point. So.
Let me add a little bit, because I certainly did not believe it was connected when they started the study. And they did, I think it was a gravity study, and there's since been a fair amount of drilling to confirm that there is this connection between the two.
Okay. And does the clay layer increase the flow rate through that section so that it's not a, and is that included in the in ModFlow?
In our version of ModFlow, we include the clay as a layer, and we allow water to flow laterally through that gap through the clay, because there is clay that fills that gap as well.
Sure.
In our version of the model, we do allow that, and it makes a significant difference, because there you either have to have the water come up into the Manhan River or it goes through the gap. Right. And in our simulation, it goes through the gap. A fair amount of it through the clay horizontally.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Lara Friedland-Case, and I just had a question about maintenance. The landfills that exist now, or the proposed landfill, how much maintenance would be involved in keeping it safe? Like what's done on a regular basis to do that?
Typically there is, well, first of all, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that you're not allowed to construct a landfill unless you have the money up front to ensure its continued maintenance after it's closed. Is that correct, that there's a financial security requirement for building a landfill? So basically, when you build a landfill, you also submit what's known as the closure plan. You say how you're going to close it down, what engineering works you will do at the time it's closed, how it's going to be maintained, and the usual window is a 30-year window for maintenance. That, as it turns out, is the same window that's used for hazardous waste disposal sites. It comes from the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the U.S. Federal Act for Hazardous Waste Management. So that's a fairly standard number in the business, if you like. And the typical kind of thing that's required is, I believe it's probably a semi-annual inspection or a quarterly inspection. Engineer has to go out, look at the landfill, make sure there hasn't been any undue settlement, that there isn't any erosion, any problems of that sort, things that would expose the waste. There's also requirements to do maintenance. So, for example, you have to go out and cut the lawn because you don't want trees growing and roots getting down and penetrating through the cap. So there's some fairly routine kind of maintenance that's done, as well as then engineering maintenance. And if the engineers find any problems, then those have to be corrected. And basically that's funded up front so that there's some assurance that will be carried out.
Okay, for 30 years.
I think it's 30 years. Is that the window? Yeah.
Okay, because I have some concerns just looking at where we are economically and what's happening with resources, that we may not have the same resources at our disposal that we assume that we're going to have. And so I'm just wondering if that's been factored into the plans.
Well, basically you have to have the money up front.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Dr. Newton, I just wanted to appreciate your comments at the end of your presentation saying that there's going to be future generations that are going to have to deal with this problem. And I really feel like the City of Northampton is at a critical decision-making point right now. And we could go to the route of building another landfill, expanding it, and dealing with that problem that I know that, in my mind, there's not a shadow of a doubt that eventually, yes, it will leak. No matter what the technology that we put in there, eventually the contaminants will happen. And that's going into our drinking water. And I know that drinking water, my body is made up of 80% water, and going without water is by far the quickest way to a death. So I really value your acknowledgement that drinking water is our most valuable resource. And I spend much of my life dealing with trash. taking it out of the waste stream and turning it into resources. So I really think that Northampton could be a model of doing something a little bit differently. And there's a lot of examples of cities in Maine that have really talked to the corporations and demanded them to take back a lot of their electronics and have gotten them out of the waste stream. There's a huge effort, I know, by the Center for Ecological Technology here on Market Street. They've done research and they found out that 70% of what people throw out by weight could be composted. So I think that we can make a decision to just do it the same old way that it's been done, or we can really show a leadership role and try something different. And I think that there could be economic incentives with some of those plans as well.
I agree with you. I think
Don Rose for Dr. Norton.
Excuse me, sir. Did you have a
I'm sorry.
return to that? Okay. And I do want to ask that we hold our applause when we hear the comments. I know it's hard, but to keep from getting back and forth with favorites and whatnot, I'll ask that you do that. Thank you.
Dr. Norton, what percentage of the recharge area of the aquifer would be lost if the landfill was expanded? Do you have any idea?
It would be a very low percentage. I can't tell you what the percentage is. And if you're talking about the recharge area as a whole for that section of the aquifer, I would still say it's a pretty small area would be lost.
Okay, because you did speak as if there wasn't, the whole area over the aquifer was not a rechargeable area.
That's absolutely right. But there are other areas. And so the landfill is actually quite small. But if you take consideration of all the recharge areas. But the problem is that most of the water comes down through those areas. And so those become critical with regard to the chemistry. And the other thing that's interesting is that Northampton, as the city, only about 10% of the city of Northampton lies on the recharge area of the aquifer. So, 10% of the city is recharge area, but that happens to be where the landfill is located. Of course, there's a reason for that, and that's because historically the landfill was built in an old gravel pit, and the gravel pit was there because that's where you mined the resource that was the sand and gravel resource, which of course makes up the aquifer. So you had a hole in the ground, you end up filling it in. That was standard practice back then. Everybody did it.
Thank you.
My name is Andrea Donlin. I work for the Connecticut River Watershed Council. We're based out of Greenfield. Dr. Newton had a slide showing the iron flock in a wetlands downstream from the landfill, and there was a paper that described a potential association with arsenic and the flock. I was wondering if Dr. Newton could elaborate on what you think is happening in terms of landfill impacting surface water. And then I would also be curious to hear Dr. Shanahan's thoughts about what he thinks may be happening now, could happen in the future, and whether the expansion of the landfill would affect any of that.
I think what we think is happening is that the landfill, leachate from the landfill, is characterized chemically by having low dissolved oxygen. That allows iron, manganese, and arsenic to come into solution. So it gets dissolved in the water. And then as that water emerges to the surface in springs, it comes to equilibrium with the atmosphere where there's a lot of oxygen. Oxygen mixes with the water, and those ions are no longer stable in solution, and they are precipitated out in that flock. So that flock has iron and arsenic and manganese, things that were in solution that come out. So I think that's the process that's going on at that point. And the thing about it is that we're seeing that getting worse through time. Over the past 10 years, that concentrations are going up. The area of flock is expanding, so we have to figure. I think one of the things we need to find out is what is causing that. What about the landfill is generating that component?
Well, I guess what I would say is I really don't dispute that. I think that makes sense. It seems like a pretty logical geochemical model. Certainly what Dr. Newton's just explained about the chemistry is known chemistry, and that's how it operates. I think the things to be a little bit careful about here is confounding what you see there, which is probably the result of the unlined landfill, which is releasing leachate, without a liner system, and confounding that with this new state-of-the-art facility, which is not going to release, anything like that at all. Basically, the standard practice in the United States for municipal solid waste is entombment. We put it in there so that it will stay in there and not get out. And so I think to confound those two is a mistake. I think the other thing that I would caution about is there are relatively few data, and for example, Professor Newton cited that one very high zinc measurement. Well, I looked at those data and reached a very different conclusion, and that is that there seems to have been some sort of error in either sampling or analysis. One can't really tell with just one analysis, but it's such an outlier that it seemed to me to be very, very suspicious. And so that needs to be resampled and understand what's going on there. So I think it's very premature to draw conclusions from a single analysis. It's not at all uncommon to find that people have made errors in the field or in the laboratory, and so I think it's premature to draw conclusions about some of the geochemical analyses from the groundwater. The other thing I would caution about is we've talked about the geochemistry of the surface water, but we haven't talked too much about the geochemistry of the groundwater. And one of the things I neglected to show in my talk, if you notice, I didn't show any results for biochemical oxygen demand. I didn't have a map for BOD. And I meant to mention this and did not, but the reason I don't have a map is there's no plume. Basically, the BOD is consumed. Oxygen and bacterial action works on that essentially immediately, and so once you get a very short distance from the landfill, that disappears. Now, the brook is relatively close to the landfill, and so you're probably seeing some effects of that lower geochemistry. But as you get anywhere further, really, in the aquifer, the aquifer becomes oxygenated again. These chemicals that we've talked about, the arsenic, the manganese, and the iron, one of the things that happens is when they become oxygenated, they go from a soluble form to an insoluble form. That's why they come out in the brook as little particulates. They've formed an insoluble form. They're no longer in solution in the water. Well, the same thing happens in the aquifer. They basically plate out on the aquifer materials, and they don't continue to migrate. Those plumes that Dr. Newton showed, where he had kind of gray colors coming off of the landfill in the arsenic plume, he qualified in saying those were not model results. Those were kind of schematic. Well, they're very exaggerated schematics based on our model runs. There is essentially, I would not expect any kind of a plume of that sort based on what we modeled. And we actually did do a model of dissolved oxygen and BOD in the aquifer.
Dissolved oxygen model?
We used RT3D, reactive transport in 3 dimensions.
Yeah. Because we are developing a dissolved oxygen model. It's very interesting.
So you're saying the expansion is unlikely to affect anything in terms of surface water unless there was some catastrophic leakage or whatever, but the current unlined
One of the things I'd like to point out is that in fact, when the unlined landfill was capped, concentrations went down. They are now higher than they were when it was capped. So
that's in groundwater monitoring.
Yeah, in the groundwater. So that we don't know where that's coming from, and if the cap is what prevented it from caused it to go down, then what caused it to go up? I think that's a question. We don't know the answer to that.
Right. Okay.
But I think it's an important question to answer.
Thank you.
I'm told I should speak right into the mic, so I'll try to do that. My name is Bill Ames, and I think I'm the only one, certainly in this room, but probably in the city, who was on the city council when we put the landfill out there where it is right now. That first section is unlined because we were told at the time that you just needed to have a certain number of feet between the top of the landfill, the bottom of the landfill and the water table, and that would be fine. So that's what we did. I would just make a couple of observations. No matter how many test wells you dig, or however you do them, drill, there's going to be people, there'll be people who come in and say, but you didn't do them here and here, and this is where the problem is, and you didn't drill there. So you can't satisfy people by drilling wells. I mean, it's a good thing to do because we should know where stuff is going, but it's not going to help very much. The other thing that I would point out is that there's one fact that I heard here tonight that I'm glad we didn't hear 40 years ago. Something about 90% of Northampton is not on the aquifer. Because people said to me back those 40 years ago, why don't you put that in Ward 2? Now that's the district I represent in Northampton. Why don't you put it in Ward 2 instead of out here on Glendale Road? And if they had known that that was a safe area, I would have had a lot of pressure to put it in Ward 2. And if you know the city, Ward 2 is heavily residential. Smith College is there. We could have taken out a couple of buildings at Smith and some of the residences and put it in a safe place. The other thing that I want to point out, I'm getting older and I lose my train of thought. And I did back then too, but I was able to cover up for it. I think another point I would make is back in those days and tonight, I'm hearing people who I consider very reliable, you too, are very reliable persons. You hear that all through this debate, and there comes a point where you have to make a decision. And then it comes down to maybe who do you trust, or if you fear putting it over an aquifer and maintaining it for eternity so that it doesn't pollute, then no, I don't want to do it. We've got to do that with nuclear waste, and we have no place to do it. Nobody wants it anywhere. And here we have another situation right in our own yard. And for those who would say, let's get more out of the waste stream, I say, wonderful, but there'll be something left, something that won't be recycled. Where do you want to put it? And nobody wants it. And I don't think Ward 2 does, even though we are a very safe place to put it. So I'm hearing echoes of what I heard 40 years ago, and we put it there because we had an open face burning dump at that time, and it was polluting not only the ground but the air. It had an awful odor to it, and it needed to be replaced. So I won't be here in 50 years to hear this whole debate go on again, because no matter what the technology is today, it'll be better in 50 years, and somebody's going to be angry that you put it wherever you did. So I heard someone say that the next meeting would be on alternatives, and I think that's very, very important. We hear the alternatives to ending the use of that landfill. How would we do it? Where would we do it? And at what cost? That's what I want to hear next.
Hi, I'm Tina Clark with Clean Water Action in Massachusetts, and I live in the Pioneer Valley in Amherst and Turners Falls now. I had a question for Dr. Newton, but I first just can't help but say that in the last 20 years of working on environmental issues, both in Washington and in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it's very well established that all landfills do leak. All landfills will ultimately leak, and I just really need to take exception, Dr. Shanahan, to your claim that that the materials can be relied on with certainty. And I think that was maybe a slight misstatement, and I would encourage you to choose some other language because and I think later you did. But the other concern I want to raise is all the scientific evidence, and our European colleagues are much farther ahead than we are in this country about the trace levels of synthetic toxins, solvents, plastics, all kinds of contaminants that we didn't think were a problem, and now we're finding that very, very tiny levels are damaging to health and perhaps triggering cancer in our children as well as in adults. They're saying now a vinyl shower curtain in the first trimester is enough to damage the reproductive organs of a male baby in the womb and damage the long-term memory of children. So I think we have to completely re-examine our policies on landfilling and dumping all these materials. And I just want to mention that Sweden has a recycling rate of over 80%, and that in Europe, as you probably aware, they are now recycling cars and refrigerators and taking the toxins out of their electronics. And if anybody wants to give a call, Representative Cocott has been fantastic, but we're trying to get a bill passed in this state that would reduce toxins in computers and electronic equipment, and we're being fought like crazy by the big international companies that don't want to get the toxins out of their products. But that's definitely the direction we need to go. So all landfills leak. We can achieve very high rates of recycling. We can take the toxins out, and the solution is not to build more places to dump it. Dr. Newton, I was just curious, do you think that we are facing some, and maybe Dr. Shanahan, you'd also want to comment, with global climate disruption and instability and the rapid disintegration of stability of the hydrologic system, are we at risk in some of these landfill structures that we already know are eventually going to leak, but that the intense rainstorms or some of the thawing and refreezing that we're seeing now that are wreaking havoc with our roads, that we may be in a new realm where some of the assumptions about stability of landfills may not be as likely? And how is it possible to even include these things in models? Has anyone been talking about this? I'm just curious if you think that's going to be another thing we should be wondering about.
I think it's hard to quantify those things. I think it's certainly of concern that 100-year storms, 500-year storms appear to be occurring more frequently. And if you had a 500-year event, it's likely that the landfill would be impacted by that. It's likely that whatever system was there would be overwhelmed, at least for part of the time, and who knows what the long-term effects would be. So I think that those things are potential problems. And it's potentially, you have all this flock accumulated, and you're going to wash it down somewhere and accumulate it somewhere else, and who knows? I think those are very difficult questions to really answer, but it is of concern.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any systematic work. Do you know of anything going on in climate change as far as landfill design?
Landfills are being designed all around the world under all different types of climatic conditions.
Yeah. I don't know of systematic work being done. Generally, what you're really talking about primarily is a runoff event, and landfills are designed with runoff controls and structures to divert them, and they do have a particular design limit, and those may be changing, at least gradually as climate changes, and so we'll be seeing that basically in all of our infrastructure, things like road drainage and so forth. So that there's potentially things that will need to be redesigned in the future. You had asked me about the comment I made that landfills do not leak, and I didn't intend to say that landfills do not leak, and in fact we modeled the landfills as leaking for 100 years. But what I did want to draw is a really large distinction between a modern double-lined landfill and the unlined old practice. And certainly, we're building these things with the expectation that they're going to do a good job of containing material. They're not going to contain it 100% by any means, but I suspect they're going to come very close to containing the water within the landfills to, let me put it this way, effectively completely. Water's going to leak. There's going to be some material that leaks out, but it's going to be very, very minimal. I believe, based on what I've seen of the science, what I've seen of the installations, and so forth.
But you do agree with the statement that all landfills ultimately leak.
All landfills, not ultimately, they immediately leak. There's going to, I can't tell you that, molecules won't leave the landfill. I mean, obviously material is going to leave the landfill, but we can control the rate at which it does leave, I believe.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
I am Bob Aronson from 71 Sylvester Road, about a mile north of the dump. And in Dr. Shanahan, in your presentation, you talked about a 2-day leak of some kind of catastrophic leak. How would you detect it if you're only sampling groundwater monitoring wells every 120 days?
They're basically leachate collection systems, so you're in essence constantly monitoring leachate. And the 2-day scenario was based on the notion that a leak happens during a weekend when no one is monitoring the leachate collection system, goes unnoticed for a couple of days, and a massive leak occurs. And so that's why 2 days, why that particular scenario.
So you're not seeing it in the groundwater wells, you're seeing it in some other
No, and that's one of the
control device.
Yeah, that's one of the nice features, if you like, of that double-lined landfill. You basically have a leachate collection system which allows you to monitor what's going on in the landfill, but then you also have a leak detection system. So if your primary liner is failing, you will see that in that second set of pipes that's draining the landfill. And if necessary, you go in and you make corrections. You do, you can go in and excavate it back out and patch it, and that's a fairly extreme and unusual kind of process, but that happens.
Okay, and then you talked about some other impossibilities, like every constituent that's going into the dump. You can't possibly name all of those things.
Well, no, we could name.
And that's why the state of the industry is entombment. But in Israel and in Europe, they're doing more precautionary things and biodigesting in vessels. And they certainly have land issues and water issues in Israel.
Europe actually uses a rather different approach than the United States. The United States is what they call the dry tomb approach. You try and make a tomb, you seal it up, you line it on the bottom, you cap it on the top, and you keep the water out as much as you possibly can so you keep it dry. Europe is going much more to what's known as a natural attenuation landfill. And what they actually do is they deliberately put water into the landfill, and they basically try and get these biodegradation processes cooking in the landfill, if you like. And so they kind of go the opposite direction that we do. They're trying to keep it wet, to keep the bugs cooking, to keep landfill degradation processes going on within the landfill. So, we're trying to minimize the amount of water so water won't leak out. They actually try and maximize the amount of water so that what does leak out will be diluted and will be attenuated by these biological processes and, basically kind of keep the thing cooking. So it's a rather different approach. They're going increasingly to this natural attenuation model where we're staying with this dry tomb approach. So it's a rather different approach, but under U.S. law, what's often done in Europe is really not allowed. It's frowned upon. It's not allowed at all. I mean, it would be considered unsafe as far as the environment is concerned.
Well,
but they are doing much more, I think, as far as recycling and.
I wasn't talking about doing it inside a lined landfill like YOLO in California, but more like inside vessels and inside closed buildings where people actually went in and the building's at a negative pressure and no one's had any noxious odors. And
there's
more precautionary as to what's streaming into it.
Yeah, there are composting facilities and that sort of thing as well. They're more expensive.
Yeah.
There's operational problems with those as well.
Of course. It's a huge undertaking. Thank you.
My name is Jack Horner. I live at 46 Lady Slipper Lane. Notwithstanding that we shouldn't make a decision based solely on a model, I was certainly struck by the two different, graphics. In Dr. Shanahan's model, showing things being, stopped, or maybe it's attenuated is the right word, fairly quickly, and a very, very low amount of contamination reaching the Maloney well, and then in your, in your graphic showing something completely different. And the impression I got, Dr. Newton, was that one of the big differences in the contaminant flow models was that you talked about water flowing through the clay. Would it be fair to say that that's the biggest difference, or did I miss something?
I think there are some other differences, but first, but let me just comment about one thing. The only results that I showed were of the non-reactive contaminant. So I think that Dr. Shanahan's model looked at a number of individual real contaminants that underwent natural degradation processes. And the only results that I showed were the non-reactive contaminant, which he also showed in his that went quite distant. So they weren't that far apart in those two examples.
That was the last one of mine that I showed. And they're pretty similar, I would say. Yeah.
But in terms of the structure of the model, I think the other difference is that in our model, we had hydraulic conductivities that were assigned on the basis of what we knew where the more permeable materials were based on a model of how the aquifer was deposited. And also based on where we knew, based on some observation wells and borings that have been taken in the aquifer over time, where we knew we could locate where those old river channels were coming into the lake.
So that seemed like a big difference to me, Dr. Shanahan. Did it seem like a big difference to you?
I don't think, it's certainly a difference. It's a little hard for me to say exactly how much of a difference it is because I haven't actually seen the model. I'm a bit suspicious about the flow through the clay, to be honest. I want to see how they modeled that and what they assumed for that. That doesn't strike me as something that should make a big difference. And I think I also need to see how they did the geology. There's a number of judgments that need to be made in translating geology into hydraulic conductivity. We tended to rely upon the actual measurements of the hydraulic parameters, although then we had to interpolate between those. I think it kind of reflects a little bit of a difference in background. I'm more of a groundwater hydrologist. I tend to like to do tests and use test results. Dr. Newton's more of a geologist. He would tend to rely more on the geology, and I think, there's merit in both approaches. And I just don't know enough about the details of his approach to be really able to say how much difference there is.
One of the problems is that there are only about 5 measurements of hydraulic conductivity in the whole aquifer. So you don't have much to go on.
Okay. Well,
you're assigning thousands of cells based on 5 data points.
Okay. Well, then I'll just make a final comment maybe to the Board of Public Works and the other sponsors here. It seems that we're not really seeing sort of a side-by-side model comparison here tonight. I thought maybe we were, but I'm hearing you say we're not really, and it seems that would be a helpful thing for the public to see sometime. Thank you.
Well, let me just add one thing about that, and you must understand that we have 0 resources to develop our model. I don't know how much was spent on the other model, but we spent $0 on ours.
I hear you without having the capacity to respond.
Hi, I'm Bruce Mandaro. I live at 549 Park Hill Road in Florence. I have a few questions. One is, Dr. Shanahan, you mentioned a catastrophic event over a 100-year period, I think.
No. What we said was, basically continuous leakage over 100 years, and so.
But one catastrophic event.
And then a catastrophic event over 2 days where the leachate collection system failed and a lot of water got released over a 2-day period, and that was in the middle of that 100-year period.
So my first question is, why assume only one catastrophic event? And then the follow-up question would be, what kind of events would these be that would cause things like this potentially, and what kind of solutions for some of these events would come into play? And it's a question for both of you, really.
Well, I think the answers to those are related. The reason we only assumed one is because it's a very, very rare event. We actually don't expect it to occur. And as far as the corrective measures,
what kind of events, to follow up on that?
Well, what we were looking at was basically a failure, in essence, a major pipe breach at where the leachate would be entering, for example, the leachate treatment facility at the landfill. Do I have that correct?
Or a pump station, some type of pump station.
Yeah. So we're looking at kind of the bottom end, if you like, of all the leachate collection from the landfill, failing due to a pipe breach, and that not being observed for 2 full days. So Friday night at midnight, this thing happens. No one comes back and finds it for 2 days. So, an event we would not expect to happen, week in, week out, for 100 years, obviously. So, that was why it was selected as a one-time event. And the way you prevent that kind of thing is by careful maintenance, normal operations, and so forth. I mean, the reason it is a very hypothetical event is because, landfills are not operated in a way that would allow those things to happen.
But they do sometimes. So I'm just, not theoretically, but they've happened.
I don't know of it happening, actually.
Yeah, I don't know, so that's why I'm asking.
I don't know that I've...
And are solutions to something like this, or when you talked about the 30-year plan of trying to allow for maintenance, is correcting an event like this part of the plan of allocating money? Or would this something that would have to be done on a case-by-case basis?
No. There is also part of the maintenance would be the leachate collection system, maintaining that, operating that. What happens is that the amount of leachate that's generated decreases over time, and so that maintenance requirement becomes less because less and less leachate is generated as the landfill ages and the biodegradation processes, run to their end. But certainly maintaining the leachate collection system, the pipes, and all that kind of thing, that's all part of the 30-year maintenance program.
And my final thing is, I think I heard or I read in all the stuff about this was that this is the first time a waiver has been done over an aquifer in Massachusetts. At least that's how I read it. How common is it to put landfills over aquifers in this country?
It actually is quite common. I mean, this is what was done. I mean, the history of your landfill here is very, very typical.
Well, that may not be the best decision.
Became a landfill.
Yeah, I didn't think that was the best decision. I'm looking at the map and I'm seeing so much of the town doesn't have water under it. Why did we pick that? That's really my question. Is the water is valuable? We could protect the land underneath it without it going to water. And
I think you're looking at a change in the historic perspectives that people have had. In the past, people didn't worry about the water supply so much, and so back in the 1960s, when there were a lot of gravel pits, and then the move from open burning dumps was to try to find something better than open burning dump, was to make a landfill and cover it over, and that was deemed to be much better. And so where would you going to do this? Well, you go where there's already a hole. That would be the best thing. And, of course, it just happens that they built the holes where the recharge areas, the aquifer, the two things were related. But people didn't really understand that as much. I think today most of those sites have been abandoned and closed. I don't know of any ones that are currently being cited on active recharge areas. I don't know of any.
And so I guess my final comment is, why here? Why again? And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matt Hiesiger. I'm a student. My question is directed towards Dr. Shanahan. I was wondering if you took into account the other landfills already in the if you took into account in your model the other landfills that Dr. Newton pointed out?
No, we didn't. We were really looking at, the permitting for this particular landfill, so we didn't account for the other landfills. We were looking at basically what the incremental contribution from, the landfill would be, the Northampton landfill. So we didn't consider those other ones, although I believe they at least one of them overlies the clay, so it would be much less of a factor in any case. But we're basically focusing on this landfill's impacts and not everything else in the aquifer.
Would their leachate leaking overlap and possibly add to each other?
One of them perhaps, the other one probably not so likely. But there could potentially. There could be overlapping impacts from those, and there's lots of other potential sources in an aquifer of these things. We've talked about landfills being in the zone too. Well, there are a lot of gas stations, hardware stores, all sorts of things that you don't really think about as being potential sources of chemicals that are located in Zone 2 throughout Massachusetts because of their historical location being there. I mean, we'd like to have all those things out. It's probably, you know, it's impractical to move everything out. So,
but you can't put a new gas station in a Zone 2.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, as the next person comes, I just want to say we should think in terms of about 15 more minutes. Does that sound reasonable? Because there will be a meeting with the board at 9:40. So if you have a question, I do urge you to stack the line again. No more than 4 in the line. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is J.P. Kwasinski. I'm a city councilor from East Hampton, and the citizens from my community will be drinking the water that you're all talking about. I'm very concerned about the situation because ultimately I believe even the best landfill liners will leak. And I'm not sure a 30-year period of protection is enough. I think that number probably is politically arrived at for the length of time. Your study showed that it took 41 years for the material to move from the landfill to the Maloney well. If I'm correct, your catastrophic event occurred in the 50th year of the 100-year study, so that it's likely that the results could impact very quickly and extend for a very long period of time, I would think. If you could comment on that, I would appreciate it. Also, Dr. Shanahan, I heard you say that there was a material of choice, that the landfill liner was the material of choice by the federal government standards, and it's a scientific standard. I'm wondering if that standard was designed for landfills over the water supplies and what studies there might be that relate to that. I'll leave that for a couple of moments. I have 2 other questions.
Your first question concerns the time periods, and yes, indeed, there are long time periods involved. The groundwater moves slowly, and so, you know, as we showed, it's 41 years. You know, the 100-year operational period with the 50-year accident was a hypothetical scenario. It's unlikely that landfill would actually operate for 100 years and leak at that rate for 100 years and have this operational accident within that 50-year period. It's likely to be closed before that and going into the wind down phase, if you like. So, you know, it was kind of a, if you like, a worst case scenario that we constructed to demonstrate what could possibly happen, and it was something that was discussed with the DEP beforehand and deemed to be a reasonable way to look at it. So it's simply a hypothetical, something that to represent what could possibly happen.
So if I understand you correctly, the hypothetical really could never happen because the landfill, as I understand it, is going to be open for 20 years. So a 50-year catastrophic an event that occurs 50 years from the initiation could never occur because the landfill is going to be closed. So the event would have to occur in the first 20 years, wouldn't it? And therefore, why wouldn't you model it during the first 20 years?
Well, the reason to put it out at that amount of time is you know, as I pointed out, the Maloney well is about 40 years away, travel time. And so what we wanted to do was get to what is known as a steady state condition. So basically we wanted all the contaminants that might be leaking from the landfill to reach the Maloney well. And so hence we went to 50 years. We just rounded it up a bit. And so that gives you kind of what we call a steady state solution. So basically that's as bad an impact as you're going to have from the operation of the landfill as sort of a steady operation. And then, wham, we put in an extra event and watch that for another 50 years to see what would happen. So it is, you know, it is a hypothetical situation. You're right, it's not likely to happen, but it's kind of a worst case in that we basically let all the impact from normal operation happen and then gave it the incremental impact from an accident.
But if it did happen, it would have to happen in the first 20 years. Is that correct?
Yes, but what you would see then is less impact from that, you know, that steady leakage that we modeled out as coming for 100 years. So that part of it would be less, less impact. So in essence, by doing a longer time period, it shows a worse impact.
Now, you chose a 2-day event, and you chose that the event would not occur over a long weekend. Is that true?
That's true. We picked a 2-day weekend.
And if it did occur over a long weekend, then that would be 50% more than would occur during the 2 days, I would presume.
Yes.
So there would be a worse effect, and maybe...
Yes, but if you look at those concentrations, we were, many tenfold below problematic levels. So if it's 50% higher, that would not have affected the conclusions.
Okay. It could occur twice. We don't know. I mean, there could be other possibilities, other catastrophic events.
Certainly, but I mean, I think the take-home message from our analysis, and this is what DEP accepted, is that we showed that the impacts were so de minimis. I mean, 100-fold, 1,000-fold less than what would be problematic. That you'd have to compound an awful lot of very rare events to ever possibly even approach those problematic levels. So we did a conservative analysis, and the DEP accepted as that.
I'm sorry, I didn't get to hear the response about the liner over the water supply and the design standards according to the federal government.
I don't, they're not particular to a water supply, but the reason for that design is, in essence, groundwater protection. I mean, that's the main impetus for proper landfill design. The impacts occur to groundwater. So in essence, it's a groundwater protection measure. So it wasn't particularly over a water supply or not, but the thrust of those regulations is to protect groundwater. So I guess the answer is, in essence, yes, but not explicitly.
Thank you. I guess I'm wondering Northampton has spent a lot of money for your reports and your studies. And Dr. Newton, you say you've spent zero, you've received zero funding?
Zero funding,
work.
Yes.
And you're coming up with divergent conclusions based on what seems to be a grassroots effort to study the matter with great expertise. I wonder if Northampton, and I guess you can't answer this, or the DPW, would be willing to fund further studies by Dr. Newton to help us in this matter if there would be other conclusions that would be generated. Just a thought. I must say that I just don't think it's neighborly to threaten your neighbor's water supply, and I have concerns, and I appreciate that we're all here talking about this together. Thank you very much.
Linda Heesiger, Park Hill Road. I've heard a number of things mentioned tonight. One is state of the art. State of the art, let's see, I've done a DEP file review, unfortunately or fortunately. And in 1969, the unlined landfill, surprise of surprise, was considered state of the art. However, there was the clarion call from a city-hired engineer, Edson White, who said, don't put the landfill there. There's an aquifer under there. The brook will turn red. But Calderwood Enterprises had their engineer, Elmer Huntley, who said, it's fine, put the landfill there, okay? As we know, they should not have put an unlined landfill there. Now we know that, as Dr. Newton showed on the graph, that the two most recent test results from the Hannonbrook show the highest since 1995 when the landfill was capped. Also, Dr. Shanahan, you mentioned there's no leachate plume, but the 1985 Wagner report talks about a leachate plume going south of the landfill. And what I also noticed, and maybe Jim Larillo could talk about this later, unless I read it incorrectly, that Parma Paving broke a leachate pipe near, I don't remember the street off of 66, whether it was Lady Slipper Lane, and they had to test the sediment. According to the EPA, all landfills leak. So let's cut to the chase. There's a reason that it's prohibited to put a landfill in a Zone 2. Landfills are also banned from water supply protection districts. Dr. Newton, I'd like to know from you why the DEP of Massachusetts put those regulations in place for water supply protection districts and for Zone 2s.
Well, obviously, the regulations are there to protect the groundwater.
do you think that setting a precedent could open the barn door for other locations to do the same? Or
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why personally I don't know why a waiver was granted.
The report for the waiver was written by Jim Larilla. For anyone who doesn't know, when he worked for Stantec, formerly Friends Henry, that hydroanalysis has relations as consultants. They've worked together with Gradient, Hydroanalysis, Stantec, and Jim Larilla applied to the DEP, and it was Commissioner Gullidge at the end of the Romney administration. And Massachusetts has has an unfortunate history with the Woburn experience of civil action, where the DPW told the residents there that it was a right to drink from the wells, and the residents, there was a cancer cluster. And I'm not saying there's a cancer cluster by any means where the landfill is. I'm just saying history should not repeat itself. Water is a precious resource. If you read the New York Times, almost daily, on a daily basis, there's articles about clean drinking water. Massachusetts had to flood the Quabbin. Northampton needs to be a little smarter and not repeat history. Thank you.
My name is Amy Rhodes, and I live on Monroe Street in Northampton. And it seems as though Northampton was granted a waiver to have the landfill be based on this model, yet Dr. Newton said that there should be no decisions made on groundwater models because different assumptions can produce different results, and I think we did see some different results between the two models tonight. And so I'm wondering how we might go about validating these models. To what extent were these models validated by actual observed data, and would that, if in fact we are making decisions based on models, would that be an appropriate next step to take, is to try and collect appropriate data that would perhaps be used to try and validate some of these models?
Well, I'll just say that certainly both models, I presume, were validated in the same way for the hydrologic component of the model, where you can predict what the heads are at various points. I think the problem will be, I think both models probably did a pretty good job of doing that, yet when you apply the solid transport to it, you get different results, even though we could probably put the same inputs into those solid transports and get different results based on the fact that we're having different hydraulic conductivities. So the solid transport part, I don't think has been, certainly our work has not been validated for solid transport because we don't have enough data to do that. I don't know.
No, and that's I'm in the same boat. The problem with that is when you start to think about, a validation test, you're talking 40 years in this particular case, and so there really aren't the data with which to do that validation, and hence, you do these conservative assumptions. I guess there's one presumption, though, is that the fact that there certainly is a difference in the models, but as I've kind of said a couple of times, they don't strike me as being that different. I think there's a presumption that if, DEP saw Dr. Newton's model, they would change their mind, or that they, would not have granted the waiver. I'm not sure that that's the case. They seem to show very, very much the same result. They differ by a factor of, 10 or maybe 100, I'm not sure, but I mean, still we're so far below detection limits that I'm not sure that that they show anything that is effectively that much different.
Well, except that our model would predict that the conservative component would be above the MCL, so that would be the big difference.
Can you say why your result brought to that?
Say again?
Can you explain a little bit more what assumptions went into your model that brought those higher concentrations?
I mean, I haven't looked carefully enough at the differences between the two models to tell you why one predicted more than the other, but I suspect it's because of the distribution of hydraulic conductivities, how they were distributed.
And so the difference in hydraulic conductivity might explain how the difference in permeability, which I understand could affect the travel time of groundwater from the landfill, to the Maloney well, but how would that differences in hydraulic conductivity affect the chemistry?
Well, I think it's I think the changes in the again, I'd have to look at both models, and I haven't looked at the other model carefully enough to tell you why it's different, why it's giving you a different result, because I don't know.
I guess I think one thing that needs to be corrected is there is no MCL for a theoretical contaminant. MCLs are chemical specific, and to say that 10 parts per billion is above the MCL doesn't make any sense. I mean, the MCL is chemical specific, and it depends upon the concentration that would be emanating from the leachate and how it leaves the landfill. So I think the fact that he arrived at 10, starting at I guess would be a million in those units. Is that right? 1,000.
Well, I mean,
but
one of the problems is we haven't had time to do the other ones. We took the conservative because that was the quickest one we could do, and we'll do the others. We'll see how they come out.
Yeah. But recognize it is a hypothetical chemical that we're talking about as far as that result is concerned. I guess the other thing I would point out is that our work has been documented in a report. It's been reviewed by the EPA, or has it been reviewed by EPA as well as DEP? Yeah, DEP, excuse me. DEP and then SEA, the consultants for East Hampton. So, our model has been scrutinized and looked over by other parties. So.
Thanks.
I'm Ed Hagelstein. I live at 171 Nonotuck Street here in Florence. And I was elated to hear that there are areas in the city that don't have water under them. And I don't know what kind of stone is there, but I'm going to think I've never been to a quarry that didn't have water in it. And I assume that's because the stone there is just so solid, it's impervious, and the water will only evaporate it to leave. And is it possible that, say, Dr. Newton, one of your geology classes, I'm sure they are high-class geologists or budding geologists, if Smith could do some kind of a project in Northampton and locate an area that would probably take care of us for maybe the next 500 years or something like that. I'm thinking of, in a bowl-shaped, surrounded by mountains, solid, nothing leaves there. And is that a possibility?
No, it's not a possibility. In fact, what we didn't say that there was no water under those places. What we said that they weren't recharge areas to the aquifer. So it's a big difference there. In fact, the glacial till is an aquifer for everyone who has a private well in the uplands. For a lot of people, not a lot of people have bedrock wells, but the glacial till can be an aquifer to people. The bedrock, obviously, is if you're living in a hill town, you have to get your water from that rock, and there's, you have trouble with, but there's fracture porosity, there's water in fractures, there's water all over the place. Even in the Varve clay, there's water.
Yeah. There's just much less of it, and so it would not be a productive material, say, for a municipal supply well. So we differentiate the aquifers from the non-aquifers, but there's groundwater everywhere.
Okay. But would you guess that there are areas that would be much safer than the area that's chosen right now?
90% of the city would be safer than the area that's chosen now.
Okay, so a simple solution to this is just don't expand the landfill there and move it to some place where it's safer.
Right.
Where there's a higher degree of safety. Okay, yes. And just one comment about was the high cadmium number in the well, and you want to do another analysis. I worked in laboratories all my life, and you never go, if the second one says there's 0, you don't assume that that's right. You go and do a number of analyses, and I'm sure you know that to back that up. Thank you very much.
Okay, these will also be our final 3 questions.
Hi, my name is Patty Gambarini. I live on Sheldon Avenue in East Hampton, Massachusetts. And the modeling results, the differences aside, the prospect of any possibility of contamination, at the Maloney well is very disturbing. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and the idea of leaving her that sort of problem to deal with in the future is a problem. And I'm wondering whether there are good examples today of communities that are wrestling with current remediation of drinking water supplies that have been contaminated by landfills, and what the scope of the problems might be in those, if there are any sort of examples that you might know of, and dollar costs for something like that. Because I think that ought to be factored into any considerations here.
The classic example are municipal landfills that also accepted industrial waste. And so that's where, a municipal landfill, some municipal landfills have turned into Superfund sites because they accepted liquid industrial waste. And so that's kind of the classic, bad scenario. It would not happen today. It's simply not allowed. The regulations on hazardous waste are much too stringent. So that's a kind of a former problem, not a present problem. But that's kind of the classic example. I'm not aware of a municipal solid waste landfill that did not accept large amounts of industrial waste. In other words, one that took just municipal solid waste, that became a Superfund site or a major problem.
I don't think I have enough knowledge. I thought the Saco landfill did not, but I'm not sure whether it had an industrial component or not. I mean, I don't have enough background knowledge of all the sites. I know there are many examples of landfills contaminating groundwater aquifers, too many to count.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Marianne Berlin. I live in Florence. And first of all, I want to say I don't believe for 1 minute that a landfill that has been closed for 30 years is not going to leak anymore. I think it's going to leak forever. And then I have a question. What is being done about the leaks that are happening now? How are they being remedied? And then you have been comparing the old landfill that's unlined with the coming, the prospective landfill. In the meantime, 40 years have passed, and things have changed a lot. In the old landfill, there were not half as many chemicals as there are now. They didn't have plastic diapers like they have now. Every time I bring in a handful of batteries, they ask me to throw them in. So if everyone does that, there's a lot of acid in there. What does that do to the liner? And how much heat is created and how much heat can the liners take? And it's just very strange that you don't make the comparison. The old landfill, I'm sure, is much less contaminated than the new one is. And there is industrial waste here. There's a lot of construction waste that is being accepted. And with formaldehyde and all these other chemicals, I'm sure there is an effect. And I don't know what you're going to do about terrorism. Security has not been mentioned. If I were a terrorist, I would know what to do to spoil the water supply. And this would be an opportunity. And that's all I have to say.
I was just wondering, as far as your model goes, you're assuming that the aquifer is pristine so that there aren't any other chemical interactions going on there. And as far as where the landfill is sited, it's right on the edge of that clay layer, so that would be preventing the dissolved oxygen that was generally recharging up there from going to the Maloney well. In particular, when you take into account the anaerobic or aerobic reactions going on, consuming a lot of that dissolved oxygen, so that in the case of the Maloney well, where it's already approaching, I think, half the MCL for arsenic and the MCL for manganese too, it looks like the dissolved oxygen in those cases are already pretty low. So have you looked into the impact of the landfill expansion on the dissolved oxygen in that area?
We modeled the dissolved oxygen and the biochemical oxygen demand. And you're correct. Below that clay layer, we in essence don't have any oxygen entering the aquifer within our model. There may be some that actually enters in the real system, but in our model, there's zero oxygen entering wherever the clay is present. So it does get lower in oxygen as you get to the Maloney well. But as I said, we looked at the BOD, the oxygen demand contribution from the landfill itself, and that's attenuated very quickly. There's enough oxygen there to basically consume that BOD, and it's attenuated within a short distance of the landfill. There is a zone a zone in which there would be low dissolved oxygen near the landfill, but
do you think that small impact would maybe, the Maloney well is kind of already on the edge, the geochemical environment there. Do you think that since it's already on the edge of being basically anoxic, that small change would make it so that the Maloney well would be contaminated with arsenic?
No, well, our results showed it would not. Basically, the results showed that enough oxygen entered the aquifer before you go under the clay that, the effects of the BOD from the landfill were counteracted before you get under the clay. So,
do you have any response to that, Dr. Newton?
No, I'll let that pass. I'll let you respond.
Well, that's going to conclude all of the questions. Can we please give all of us, and especially our presenters, a round of applause? Well, I'll let someone else come and give closing remarks.
I'd especially like to thank Annalise for the terrific job she did, and so please give her a good hand of applause. Thank you. And thank our panelists for lasting through this and under very hot conditions, and all of you too. This now concludes the open portion, the open comment portion of our meeting, and the portion where the general public can question the panelists. What we're going to do at this point is continue the meeting with the board and question the panelists, but you're all welcome to stay if you want to hear more on the subject. But once again, thanks so much for coming, and I think we should probably take a few-minute break. And give you